He walked in the way he always does, slowly, deliberately, like a man who has decided in advance exactly how much of himself he is willing to give to any given room. Robert De Niro does not perform his entrances. He simply arrives, and the room adjusts to him, not the other way around. At 80 years old, he moved through the late show stage with the unhurried economy of someone who has long since stopped needing to announce himself, settling into the guest chair with the quiet authority of a man who has inhabited more human beings than most people will ever meet. The audience applauded with the particular reverence reserved for people who have become part of the permanent furniture of American life. He acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more. This was Robert De Niro, the man who had given American cinema some of its most devastating portraits of the human interior. The man who had gone so deep into his characters that the line between craft and obsession had never been entirely clear, even to those who worked closest with him. The man who famously said almost nothing in interviews about his process, his interior life, the private cost of what he did. Because some things, he had always implied, were not for public consumption. Stephen greeted him warmly. The band played, and for the first several minutes, everything moved in the careful, respectful rhythm of two professionals who understood each other's boundaries. They talked about the new film, about what it meant to still be working at this level, still be choosing material that challenged him rather than simply confirmed what people already knew he could do. De Niro was thoughtful and contained, the way he always was, giving enough to make the conversation real without giving anything he hadn't decided to give. And then Stephen set down his note cards. "Bob," he said, and the use of that name, informal and direct, seemed to shift something in the room. "I want to ask you about a specific film and a specific experience." De Niro looked at him. "Taxi Driver," Stephen said. 1976, Travis Bickle. What did that role cost you?" De Niro was quiet for a moment. The prepared answer was available, the one about research, about living in New York, about the physical transformation. He had given versions of it for 50 years. He didn't reach for it. "More than I understood at the time," he said. Stephen waited. "When you go deep into a character," De Niro continued slowly, "there's a process of inhabiting. You learn how they move, how they think, what the world looks like from inside their particular damage. And with Travis, the damage was very specific. He was a man who had been so completely hollowed out by loneliness and alienation that he had constructed an entire alternate reality to live inside. A reality in which he was the protagonist of something meaningful, in which his violence had purpose and his isolation had dignity." Stephen was very still. The work of playing him was the work of understanding that construction from the inside, De Niro continued, not judging it, not standing outside it and observing it, being inside it, feeling what it felt like to be a man for whom the world had become entirely unreal except for the story he was telling himself about it. He paused, and something happened that I have never talked about publicly. The studio was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with attention. "We were deep in production," De Niro said. "Months in. I was living inside Travis's reality the way the role demanded, not method for the sake of biography, but because the character required a total immersion that I couldn't achieve from the outside. And one night, I came home from a long day on set, late. The apartment was dark, and I went to the bathroom, and I turned on the light, and I looked in the mirror." He stopped. The pause that followed was not performed. It was the pause of a man arriving at something he had held for 50 years and finding that it still had weight. "And I didn't recognize myself," he said. "Not in the way actors sometimes say that, metaphorically, as a reflection on the transformation of the role. I mean literally. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, I looked at the face in the mirror, and I did not know whose face it was. I did not know who was looking back at me. The silence in the studio was total. "What did you do?" Stephen asked softly. I stood there, De Niro said. I stood there and I waited for it to pass. And it did pass. After a few seconds, the recognition came back and I knew where I was and who I was and what was happening. But in those seconds, he stopped again. In those seconds, I understood something about Travis Bickle that I hadn't fully understood before. I understood what it felt like to look in a mirror and not find yourself there. And I understood that for Travis, that wasn't a moment of terror. It was his permanent condition. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Stephen stood up from behind his desk, quietly, without announcement, and walked around to sit on the edge of it, facing De Niro directly. "Bob," he said carefully, "you said that the recognition passed, that after a few seconds you knew who you were again." He paused. "Were you relieved?" De Niro looked at him. The question sat in the air between them. And then, De Niro said the thing he had never said, the thing that had lived in a private room inside him for half a century, behind every interview where he had spoken about craft and process and the technical demands of inhabiting difficult characters. The thing that was the real answer to every question about what it cost. "No," he said quietly. "I wasn't relieved." Stephen's expression did not change. He simply held the space. There was something in those seconds that was quiet, De Niro said. Something in not knowing who you are, in the absence of the self and all its noise and its history and its accumulated weight. Something that felt like, I don't have a better word for this. Something that felt like rest. He looked at his hands. And when the recognition came back, when I was De Niro again with all of that, all the expectation and the reputation and the history and the responsibility, part of me was disappointed. He paused. And that frightened me, that the absence of myself felt like relief. That for 3 seconds or 5 seconds in front of a bathroom mirror, not knowing who I was felt easier than knowing. The first tear came then, quiet, unhurried, the way everything about De Niro was, with the particular economy of a man who does not waste movement. "I finished the film," he said. "I came back to myself, and I've been very careful ever since about how deep I go, not because I was afraid of losing myself again, but because I was afraid of wanting to." Stephen looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know what I think?" Stephen said. His voice was low and careful. "I think what you just described is the most honest thing any actor has ever said about this work, because you're not describing a breakdown or a crisis or a loss of control. You're describing the moment when you understood what it actually costs, and the moment when you understood why some people keep paying it anyway." De Niro looked at him. "The peace in not knowing who you are," Stephen continued. "That's not Travis Bickle's pathology. That's a human thing, a very human thing, the exhaustion of being someone, the relief, sometimes, of the spaces between." He paused. "The difference between you and Travis is that you found your way back, and you've been finding your way back in every role since." Something moved across De Niro's face, slow and complicated, the way things move in faces that have spent their whole lives learning to control what shows. "I've played a lot of men who couldn't find their way back," De Niro said. "That's most of what I've done. Men who got lost inside themselves and never found the door. And I've always understood them, technically understood them, intellectually understood them. But that night in the bathroom, I understood them from the inside, from somewhere I didn't know I could reach." He wiped his eye once, briefly, with the back of his hand, then lowered it and continued looking straight at Stephen. "The work asks you to go places that the self protects you from ordinarily," De Niro said. "And sometimes what you find there is darkness, which you expected. And sometimes what you find is something more complicated, something that has its own terrible logic, its own coherence, and you have to come back from it and pretend that it didn't make sense, pretend that you don't understand why people get lost. But you do understand. You understand exactly. Stephen looked out at the audience for a moment, then back at Niro. I want to ask you one more thing, Stephen said, and you don't have to answer it. De Niro waited. Do you still have moments, Stephen said carefully, where you look in the mirror and feel that quiet, that relief in the spaces between? De Niro was still for a long time. Yes, he said finally. Less often, but yes. And what do you do with it? I use it, De Niro said simply. In the work, I take it in there and I use it because it belongs there. It's part of the material. And as long as it stays in the work, as long as I can put it somewhere that has a frame around it and an audience and a defined end, then it's not a problem. Then it's just craft. He paused. The day it stops going into the work and starts staying in the bathroom is the day I'll stop. Stephen nodded slowly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, looking at the audience, Robert De Niro just told you something that 50 years of interviews never got to. Not because he was hiding it, because nobody asked the right question. And what he told you is this, that the greatest acting in cinema history came from a man who was willing to go somewhere most people never go, and who understood from the inside why some people never come back. He looked at De Niro. Thank you for coming back, Stephen said. Every time. De Niro looked at him, and for just a moment, the briefest, most unguarded moment, the face that had inhabited Travis Bickle and Jake LaMotta and Vito Corleone and Michael and Jimmy and all the rest of them showed something that none of them had ever shown. Simply itself. Simply Robert De Niro, 80 years old, sitting in a chair under bright lights, having said the true thing, carrying what it costs, still here. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered what it was for.